The private jet stood like a gleaming monument on the tarmac, its silver fuselage catching the late afternoon sun in a dazzling display of light, a sleek testament to wealth and exclusivity that promised an unparalleled journey for the fortunate few who crossed its threshold, their designer suitcases rolling effortlessly behind them as they were ushered aboard with the kind of deference reserved for royalty, though none among them could have predicted the storm of confrontation brewing within its luxurious confines. Inside, the cabin was a vision of extravagance, a sanctuary of comfort where rows of plush leather seats stretched out in perfect harmony, their rich chestnut hues offset by delicate gold accents that traced the edges of the walls and fixtures, casting a warm glow across the space, while a faint strain of classical music, soft violins and a distant piano, drifted through the air, mingling with the low hum of the engines to create an atmosphere of serene sophistication, a bubble of privilege that seemed untouched by the chaos of the world below. Passengers settled into their places with practiced ease, some tapping away at their phones with the bored nonchalance of those accustomed to such luxury, their fingers dancing across screens displaying stock tickers or social media feeds, while others accepted flutes of chilled champagne from the flight crew, whose crisp navy uniforms and polished smiles spoke of years spent perfecting the art of service, their movements fluid and precise as they glided through the aisles, trays balanced with an almost balletic grace. Among them was Aisha Carter, a woman in her late 30s whose presence was as striking as it was understated, her tailored charcoal gray suit hugging her frame with a quiet elegance that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless, the fabric smooth and unadorned save for a single silver pin on her lapel, a subtle nod to her personal style. She moved with a deliberate grace, her steps measured and her dark eyes sweeping the cabin briefly before she settled into her seat near the front, her posture relaxed yet poised, her hands resting lightly on her lap as she gazed out the small oval window at the tarmac stretching into the distance, her mind already drifting to the purpose of this flight, a journey not just across miles but into the heart of the empire she'd built from nothing. A network of businesses and investments that spanned continents, though she wore her power like a well-kept secret, preferring the anonymity that allowed her to observe the world around her without the distortion of recognition, her calm exterior masking the sharp intellect and steely resolve that had carried her to this moment. Near the entrance stood Megan, the lead flight attendant, her navy uniform pressed to perfection, her sharp cheekbones and tightly pinned auburn hair framing a face that radiated control, her green eyes scanning the cabin with a hawk-like intensity. She greeted each passenger with a calculated warmth, her smile bright and genuine for some, like the elderly couple Mr. and Mrs. Thompson who sat just behind Aisha, their comfortable demeanor marking them as seasoned travelers, Mrs. Thompson clutching a small embroidery kit with nimble fingers already itching to work, her gray curls bouncing slightly as she adjusted her glasses, and Mr. Thompson flipping through a financial magazine with a look of mild curiosity, his silver hair catching the light as he nodded absently to Megan's greeting, but when her gaze landed on Aisha, that warmth vanished, replaced by a clipped, "Welcome aboard," that carried none of the hospitality she'd offered others, a subtle slight that hung in the air like a faint chill. One Aisha registered with a quick glance over her shoulder, her calm brown eyes catching the disparity though her expression remained unruffled, her lips parting slightly as if to speak but closing again, choosing silence over confrontation for now. Megan prided herself on maintaining order, a self-appointed guardian of the plane's hierarchy, her world governed by the belief that she could read people in an instant, her judgments swift and unapologetic, rooted in years of sizing up passengers by their clothes, their accents, their demeanor. Appearances mattered more to her than anything else, and Aisha, with her unflashy sophistication and lack of overt deference, didn't fit the mold of the privileged elite Megan deemed worthy of her respect, a snap decision that planted the seeds of a conflict she couldn't yet fathom, her prejudice simmering beneath her polished exterior as she watched Aisha settle in, her lips pursing slightly, her mind already labeling the woman as an outsider in a space she'd claimed as her domain, her irritation growing with every second. Aisha remained calmly in her seat, a quiet challenge to the authority Megan held so dear. The passengers found their rhythm quickly, sinking into the plush seats as the cabin filled with the soft buzz of conversation and the clink of glassware, a symphony of privilege that played out in small gestures, Mrs. Thompson's needle threading through fabric with a rhythmic click, Mr. Thompson's magazine rustling as he turned a page. The woman with the designer scarf 2 rows back whispering to her companion about the latest gala she'd attended, her voice a low hum of gossip that carried just far enough to be noticed. Megan moved through the aisles with brisk efficiency, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor, pausing to check on the Thompsons with a syrupy, "Good afternoon. So lovely to have you with us again," her tone dripping with charm as Mrs. Thompson shook her head politely, her fingers never pausing as she wove a delicate pattern into the cloth, and Mr. Thompson nodded toward his steaming coffee, content with the service, his eyes flicking briefly to Megan before returning to an article about market trends. But when she passed Aisha, her demeanor shifted starkly, her lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes flicking to the sleek leather satchel tucked neatly under Aisha's seat with a flicker of disdain, offering none of the courtesies she'd extended to others, simply gliding by as if Aisha were a ghost, an act of erasure that Aisha noted with a quiet tilt of her head, her hands resting lightly on her lap as she tracked Megan's retreating figure down the aisle, her mind turning over the slight, filing it away like a piece of evidence in a case she hadn't yet decided to prosecute. Megan, in her early 40s, carried herself with the precision of a drill sergeant, her pristine uniform a shield for the sharp edges of her personality. She thrived on control, her world governed by the belief that she could read people in an instant, and Aisha, with her calm self-assurance and lack of ostentatious jewelry or loud chatter, didn't register as someone who belonged in this rarefied air, a judgment that gnawed at Megan as she watched Aisha settle in, something about the woman's quiet confidence rubbing her the wrong way, stirring an irritation she couldn't quite name, a feeling that grew with every glance she stole in Aisha's direction, her green eyes narrowing as she catalogued the details, the plain suit, the lack of a designer handbag, the absence of the performative gratitude she expected from passengers in this section. She decided then and there that Aisha didn't fit, not in this section, not on this plane, and so she approached with quick, purposeful strides, her lips curling into a tight smile as she said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I think you're in the wrong section," her tone polite on the surface but laced with a condescension that hung heavy in the air, a challenge disguised as courtesy, to which Aisha replied evenly, glancing up with a steady gaze. "I believe this is my seat," her voice firm yet devoid of hostility, a response that only sharpened Megan's edge as she countered, "I don't think so, this section is reserved for our priority passengers," her smile still fixed but her eyes narrowing, her hands resting on her hips as if to assert her dominance. Nearby, a few passengers turned their heads. The woman with the designer scarf leaned forward, her curiosity piqued, her fingers adjusting the silk around her neck as she whispered to her companion, while a middle-aged man in a crisp suit across the aisle frowned slightly at Megan's tone, sensing the undercurrent of tension, his brow furrowing as he set his phone down to watch, though Aisha remained unruffled, her reply cutting through the noise with calm precision, "You might want to check your passenger list before making assumptions," a suggestion that struck Megan like a challenge, her irritation flaring as she snapped, "I don't need to check anything. I know who belongs here and who doesn't," her voice rising just enough to draw whispers from the cabin, the air thickening with anticipation as the exchange unfolded, a standoff between Megan's brittle authority and Aisha's unyielding calm. The whispers spread like ripples across a still pond, some passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the two women, others leaning into the drama with the eagerness of spectators at a play. One muttered under his breath, "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong spot?" his voice low but audible, while another shrugged, probably trying to snag a free upgrade. Their words a faint hum beneath the growing standoff, a chorus of judgment that Aisha seemed to hear but chose to ignore, her composure a wall Megan couldn't breach as the flight attendant crossed her arms and declared, "If you don't move to the back of the plane, I'll call security," her voice loud enough to echo through the cabin, a threat delivered with the certainty of someone who'd never been defied, met with Aisha's serene response, "Call whoever you need to, I'm not moving," a statement that left Megan visibly rattled. Her authority challenged in a way she hadn't expected, her green eyes widening for a fraction of a second before narrowing again, her hands dropping to her sides as she struggled to regain her footing. She turned sharply to a younger attendant, Sophie, who stood nearby, her nervous eyes darting between the two women, her blonde ponytail swaying slightly as she shifted her weight, and barked, "Sophie, escort her to the back now," her tone clipped and commanding. But Sophie hesitated, her fingers twitching toward the passenger manifest clipped near the galley. As if tempted to verify Aisha's claim, her hazel eyes flickering with uncertainty, only to freeze under Megan's withering glare, reluctantly nodding and stepping forward as Aisha said softly, "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," her words carrying a quiet weight that hung in the air, a warning wrapped in velvet that Megan dismissed with a scoff. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Get up," her impatience boiling over, her hands gesturing sharply toward the rear of the plane. Her voice cutting through the hum of the engines like a blade. The cabin watched in stunned silence, the air crackling with tension as Megan repeated, "You're not supposed to be here," her tone now tinged with a desperation she couldn't quite mask, to which Aisha replied quietly, "You shouldn't judge people you don't know," a subtle rebuke that Megan met with a sneer, "and you shouldn't sit where you don't belong," her confidence unshaken until Aisha reached for her phone, her movements deliberate as she typed a quick message and set it down on the armrest, saying simply, "You're making a mistake," her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Megan's mounting agitation, her words hanging in the air like a promise of something yet to come, leaving Megan to falter for a split second before she brushed it off, turning away to resume her duties with a forced air of command, though the unease had begun to creep into her chest, a faint tremor in her hands as she gripped the edge of her tray, her mind racing with the possibility that she'd misjudged the situation, though she shoved the thought aside, refusing to entertain the idea that Aisha might be more than she appeared. Time passed in a slow, simmering tension, the cabin settling into an uneasy rhythm as Megan moved briskly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor, a tray of sparkling water balanced in her hands, her expression tight with irritation as she served the Thompsons first, their appreciative nods fueling her sense of purpose, Mrs. Thompson pausing her embroidery to murmur a soft, "Thank you," her voice warm, and Mr. Thompson lifting his cup in a small salute. Before returning to his magazine, then moving to others in the back, deliberately bypassing Aisha until the tray was nearly empty, the glasses clinking faintly as she adjusted her grip, Aisha, waiting patiently, finally spoke up, her tone gentle but firm, "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Megan paused, glancing at her with a dismissive, "I'll get to you when I can," her voice curt as she walked off without a second glance, leaving Aisha to shift slightly in her seat, stretching one leg into the aisle to adjust her position, the dampness from the earlier incident still clinging to her trousers, a reminder of Megan's earlier slight. When Megan returned, her sharp eyes caught the movement, and instead of asking Aisha to move, she veered deliberately into her path, her foot striking Aisha's leg with a force that seemed almost intentional, tipping the tray and sending glasses of water tumbling forward, splashing onto Aisha's lap and the floor in a cascade of liquid and shattered crystal. Megan gasped theatrically, her voice sharp and loud, "Watch where you're putting your legs, you've caused a mess." But Aisha looked up, startled yet composed, brushing at the water on her trousers as she said calmly, "You walked into my leg," her gaze unwavering as she added, "I've only asked for the same respect as everyone else. If that's too much, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." her words landing like a quiet thunderclap, cutting through Megan's bluster as the flight attendant's face flushed with anger, stepping closer as she hissed, "You think you can talk to me like that?" And then, in a shocking moment of unchecked frustration, she raised her hand and slapped Aisha across the face, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot, drawing gasps from the passengers, the man in the suit half standing in disbelief, his phone clattering to the floor, Sophie's hands flying to her mouth in horror, her eyes wide with shock, and even the woman with the scarf gaping in disbelief, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of unease, her hand clutching her companion's arm as the cabin fell into a stunned silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Aisha straightened slowly, her hand resting calmly on her lap, her expression unchanged but her eyes burning with a quiet intensity as she looked up at Megan and said softly, "You just made the worst mistake of your life," her voice slicing through the stunned silence with an authority that made Megan hesitate for the first time, her confidence shaken though she quickly recovered, her jaw tightening as she snapped, "Cross the line? You've been disruptive since you got on this plane." But Aisha didn't flinch, her response measured and firm, "I've been patient with you, but your behavior has crossed a line, you'll regret this," her calm unshaken even in the face of such blatant aggression, her silence speaking louder than any outburst, her cheeks still stinging from the blow but her dignity intact. Sophie, watching from the corner, felt her discomfort peak. She'd seen Megan's hostility escalate all day. The way she'd singled Aisha out from the moment she boarded, the coldness in her tone, the deliberate slights, and now this, an act of violence that shattered the veneer of professionalism she'd been trained to uphold, and she couldn't stay silent any longer, slipping away discreetly to pull out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number and whispered, "It's Sophie, we have a situation on the plane," her voice hushed but resolute as she glanced back at the scene, her heart pounding as she returned to her post, her face a mix of worry and determination. Knowing she'd done the right thing even if it meant risking Megan's wrath, Megan, oblivious to the call, stood with her arms crossed, her anger simmering but her authority waning as passengers began to shift their allegiance, their eyes darting between her and Aisha, who remained seated, water still dripping from her suit, her posture a pillar of quiet defiance. She looked at Megan and said firmly, "All you had to do was treat me with respect, but you failed because you judged me without knowing me," her voice steady, her words a mirror held up to Megan's prejudice, to which Megan retorted mockingly, "Respect? Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't deserve mine," her tone dripping with venom, her hands clenching at her sides as she leaned closer, her green eyes flashing with defiance, igniting a flicker of anger in Aisha's eyes as she replied sharply, "You shouldn't have said that," her tone carrying an unspoken weight that left Megan momentarily unsettled, a chill running down her spine though she waved it off with a dismissive, "I'm not afraid of your empty threats, you'll regret this." "Not me," her bravado masking a growing unease as she glanced around, finding no support in the passengers' disapproving stares, the man in the suit glaring at her with arms crossed, his jaw tight with silent judgment, the woman with the scarf whispering to her companion in disbelief, her voice trembling slightly, and Sophie clutching the manifest as if it held the key to unraveling the mess Megan had created, her hands shaking as she watched the scene unfold, knowing the tide was turning against her superior. The cabin fell into an uneasy hush, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of movement as passengers exchanged glances, their earlier indifference replaced by a mixture of shock and curiosity, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened, the slap still echoing in their minds like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. Megan paced near Aisha's seat, her frustration bubbling over, her polished exterior cracking as she struggled to regain control, her hands twitching as if itching to lash out again, though she held back, her mind racing with the realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, though she refused to admit it even to herself. Aisha remained seated, calm and composed, her damp suit a badge of Megan's disrespect, her movements deliberate as she reached for her phone again, typing another quick message before setting it down. The gesture simple but charged with an unspoken power that made Megan glance uneasily at the device, her voice sharp as she demanded, "What do you think you're doing?" Aisha didn't respond immediately, leaning back slightly in her seat, her calm demeanor unwavering as she said softly, "You'll find out soon enough," her words carrying a weight that deepened Megan's unease, a sinking feeling in her gut that she couldn't shake, though she masked it with a forced smirk, turning away to busy herself with the tray, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranged the remaining glasses. Her thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger and doubt, the silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional whisper from the passengers. The woman with the scarf leaned toward her companion, her voice barely audible, "What's going on? Do you think she's someone important?" Her eyes wide with speculation, while the man in the suit sat quietly, a knowing look on his face as he tapped his fingers against the armrest, his gaze fixed on Aisha as if he'd pieced together a puzzle no one else had solved, his silence a stark contrast to the growing murmur around him. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin, heavy and deliberate. The cockpit door swung open, and the pilot stepped out, his face pale, his uniform slightly rumpled as if he'd been roused from a moment of rest, his stride purposeful as he scanned the room briefly before walking directly toward Megan, his movements quick and tense, his jaw set in a hard line. Megan turned to him, her irritation evident, her arms crossing as she demanded, "What's going on?" her tone sharp, but the pilot stopped in front of her, his posture rigid as he said tersely, "You need to step aside," his voice firm but laced with discomfort, his eyes flicking briefly to Aisha before returning to Megan, who frowned, her confusion deepening. "Excuse me? Why would I need to step aside? I'm handling this," her voice rising with indignation, but the pilot's gaze hardened, his words cutting through her protest. "I just received a call from management. The owner of this plane is on board, and it's Miss Carter," pointing to Aisha, his statement landing like a thunderclap, gasps rippling through the cabin as the woman with the scarf inhaled sharply, whispering, "She owns the plane," her voice tinged with disbelief, while the man in the suit nodded knowingly, muttering under his breath, "I had a feeling," as if the revelation confirmed a suspicion he'd held all along, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around him. Megan stared at the pilot, her face turning an alarming shade of red, her voice faltering as she stammered, that can't be true, there must be some mistake," her usual sharpness dissolving into a tremble, her hands dropping to her sides as she grappled with the words, her mind reeling as the reality began to sink in, though she clung to denial like a lifeline. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence broken only by the hum of the engines and the rustling of passengers shifting in their seats, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and anticipation, the memory of the slap still fresh in their minds, a vivid image that now took on a new weight in light of the pilot's words. Then, without warning, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but urgent, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent." The announcement sending a murmur of confusion through the cabin, the man in the suit leaning toward Aisha, whispering, "What's happening? Why are we landing?" his tone curious but respectful, though Aisha didn't answer, her expression serene but unreadable, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she gazed out the window, the world below coming into sharper focus as the plane began its descent. The jet touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the tarmac with a gentle thud, and moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up alongside, its tinted windows gleaming in the fading light, the doors swinging open as two sharply dressed assistants stepped out, their tailored suits and brisk movements exuding authority. They ascended the plane's steps with quiet confidence, their presence commanding attention as they entered the cabin, one of them saying warmly, "Miss Carter, everything is ready for your review." their voice respectful, their eyes fixed on Aisha with a deference that left no room for doubt, gasps rippling through the cabin as Megan froze, her face draining of color, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. Her earlier bravado crumbling as she stammered, "Miss Carter," her voice barely above a whisper, the assistants ignoring her entirely, their focus solely on Aisha, one asking, "Do you need anything before we proceed?" Their tone deferential as Aisha stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, adjusting her damp suit with a flick of her wrist, her calm demeanor radiating power as she finally spoke, her voice steady and commanding, "I'm Aisha Carter. I own this plane and this airline." Her gaze sweeping across the cabin before locking onto Megan, who stood like a statue, her mouth opening and closing but no words emerging, her earlier confidence replaced by sheer panic as Aisha continued, "Megan, your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful. You've humiliated yourself, mistreated me, and tarnished the reputation of this airline," her words cutting through the silence like a blade, leaving Megan trembling, her voice breaking as she whispered, I didn't know, to which Aisha held up a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to treat me with the respect every passenger deserves. You made assumptions, you acted with prejudice, and you escalated a situation that could have been handled with basic decency," her tone firm, her eyes unyielding as passengers nodded in agreement, Mr. Thompson setting his magazine aside with a small nod of approval, Mrs. Thompson pausing her embroidery to watch with quiet admiration, their earlier silence giving way to murmurs of support, their faces glowing with a newfound respect for the woman who turned the tables with such grace. Aisha stood tall, her damp suit a testament to Megan's disrespect, her movements deliberate as she straightened her blazer and looked directly at Megan, her gaze calm but commanding. "There's no mistake in your actions, Megan. You judged me without knowing me, and now there are consequences," her tone quiet yet carrying an authority that silenced the entire cabin, Megan's eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline, but finding none, the passengers watching silently, some with their phones discreetly raised, capturing the moment as it unfolded, a record of justice in the making. Aisha took a step closer, her voice steady, "While you were busy judging me, you failed to do your job. Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are or what you assume about them," her words a quiet indictment that left Megan speechless, her hands clenching at her sides as she struggled to find a defense, her mind racing with excuses that wouldn't come, the weight of everyone's eyes pressing down on her like a physical force. Aisha turned to the pilot, her tone firm, "I want this addressed immediately. I want to ensure this never happens again to anyone," her words a directive that brooked no argument, the pilot nodding briskly, "Understood, Miss Carter," his voice professional as he stepped forward, blocking Megan's path as she took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to flee, her eyes darting toward the exit, but before she could move, two uniformed police officers boarded the plane, their boots heavy on the steps, their presence sending a wave of murmurs through the cabin, Megan's face turning ashen as they approached, one saying respectfully, "Miss Carter, we received your report. Are you pressing charges?" his tone formal, his partner producing a pair of handcuffs as Aisha nodded, "Yes, this individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses, and I expect her to be held accountable," her voice unwavering, her decision final as Megan gasped, stepping back, "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to," her voice desperate, cracking under the strain, but the officer stepped forward, his tone steady, "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." His partner securing the cuffs around Megan's wrists as she shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her pleas tumbling out in a frantic rush, "Please, Miss Carter, I'm sorry, I didn't know," her voice breaking as she sobbed, but Aisha's expression remained impassive, her reply cold and cutting, "Your apology means nothing without accountability. You made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences." Her words a final verdict as the officers escorted Megan down the aisle, her once dominant figure now a defeated shadow, her arrogance replaced by regret and humiliation, the passengers watching in stunned silence as she disappeared from view, the weight of her actions crashing down around her like a house of cards. The cabin erupted into applause as the officers exited, the sound swelling with a mix of relief and admiration, Mr. Thompson giving a small cheer, his magazine forgotten on his lap, Mrs. Thompson setting her embroidery aside to clap politely, her eyes bright with approval, the woman with the scarf joining in with a vigorous nod, her earlier skepticism replaced by awe. Aisha turned back to the passengers, her voice steady as she addressed them, "To everyone here, I apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes, and moving forward, we will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Her words met with nods and murmurs of agreement, the atmosphere shifting from tension to a quiet triumph as she turned to Sophie, the younger attendant who'd quietly supported her throughout the ordeal, her tone softening. "Sophie, I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered. You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion," her words drawing a wide-eyed nod from Sophie, her face lighting up with gratitude as she stammered, "Thank you, Miss Carter," her voice soft but filled with emotion. Aisha smiled briefly, a rare crack in her composed exterior, before stepping toward the exit, her assistants following closely behind, their briefcases snapping shut as they briefed her on her next meeting. The plane's atmosphere transformed completely, the earlier tension replaced by a warmth and relief that spread through the cabin like a bomb, justice served in a way that left an indelible mark on everyone who'd witnessed it, a lesson in power and dignity that would echo far beyond that single flight. The woman with the scarf leaned forward, her voice bright with admiration. "Miss Carter, you're incredible," she blurted out, her words tumbling over themselves, to which Aisha turned, offering a gentle smile. "Thank you, remember this moment. It's always worth standing up for what's right," her reply simple but profound as she stepped off the plane, the fresh air of the tarmac greeting her like a cleansing breath, the black SUV waiting patiently, its driver holding the door open as she slid inside, her thoughts lingering on the day's events, a quiet satisfaction settling over her as she gazed out at the horizon, knowing she'd turned an act of disrespect into a catalyst for change. Weeks later, Aisha sat in a sleek studio for a televised interview, her charcoal suit replaced by a deep burgundy blazer, her demeanor as poised as ever, the interviewer leaning forward, captivated by her story. "Miss Carter, your experience has gone viral. Millions have seen how you handled this situation. What message do you want to send?" His voice eager, his pen poised over a notepad. And Aisha's gaze was steady as she answered, her voice clear and resolute, "Respect is a right, not a privilege. Everyone deserves dignity, no matter how they look, where they come from, or what others assume about them. True leadership is about setting that standard and ensuring it's upheld." Her words ringing with conviction, the interviewer nodding, visibly moved. "And what would you say to those who face similar challenges but don't have your platform?" His tone softer now, and Aisha's expression softened. "I'd say strength comes from within. Even when you feel invisible, remember your worth. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect, just the courage to stand firm in who you are." Her reply a beacon of hope that resonated across the airwaves, sparking conversations that stretched far beyond the studio. Later, she boarded another flight, greeted by a new crew whose energy was warm and professional, the lead attendant offering a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter. It's an honor." His voice sincere as she settled into her seat, the atmosphere lighter, the service impeccable, filled with the respect she'd fought to instill, a sense of peace washing over her as she gazed out the window, the runway blurring into the sky, knowing her actions had rippled outward, inspiring a shift in a system that had too long tolerated prejudice, her quiet triumph a legacy that would endure. not just in the policies she'd implement but in the hearts of those who'd seen her stand tall. A reminder that the most powerful victories were often the ones that changed the world one act of courage at a time.